On the 5th of May 1930, Amy Johnson set out for the longest journey of her life. She had only been flying for a year and a half and only had a pilot's licence for a year. She had never before flown outside of England. In fact, her longest journey to that point had been from London to Hull. And yet here she was, 26 years old, about to fly alone 11,000 miles from England to Australia. She would fly through monsoons, desert sandstorms, over jagged mountain ranges and oceans teeming with sharks before landing successfully in Australia in 20 days. This is a story of Amy Johnson, Yorkshire's flying queen. So join me as we look at this part of Yorkshire's hidden history. Amy Johnson was born here in 1903, the same year that the Wright brothers made their landmark flight. She inherited the spirit of adventure from her family. Her grandfather was a Norwegian fisherman and her father had once travelled to Canada in search of gold. One day, as the story goes, as a child she happened to see a plane in a newsreel at the cinema and was transfixed. She sat through the entire programme again just to get another glimpse of it. It wasn't until shortly after her 16th birthday that she first took a ride in a plane. 5 minutes later they were back on Earth and she was immensely disappointed. Fortunately, this did not deter her. Moving to London, she got a job at a solicitor's. Fortunately, she lived fairly close to the London Aeroplane Club's airfield at Edgware. This was right in the middle of the 1920s flying craze. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh made the first solo transatlantic flight. In 1928, the Australian Burt Hinkler was the first to fly solo from England to Australia in 15.5 days. That same year, Mary Heath was the first to fly solo from South Africa to England, and Mary Bailey had completed the longest female solo flight, a 16,000-mile-long return trip from England to South Africa in 1928 and 29. It is in this context that Amy took her first flying lesson in 1928. But it was a complete disaster. Fortunately, she persevered, saving up her wages for lessons until, in June 1929, she made her first solo flight. The first woman to get a pilot's licence was in 1911. When Amy received hers, she was only the 37th woman to do so. But she was not content with simply flying planes, she wanted to fix them as well. To that end, she began hanging around with the mechanics, to some chagrin, before eventually working full-time at the aerodrome. Shortly afterwards, she passed her ground engineer's certificate exam, becoming the first British woman to do so. The list of records to break was swiftly dwindling and Amy was probably feeling quite anxious to get going and break one. This desire found itself travelling all the way to the Dundee Courier in this article from January 10th, 1930, in which Amy reportedly declared that she wanted to beat Burt Hinkler's record. Despite numerous factual errors in the article, it was enough to cause a stir and draw significant attention to her mission. However, few were willing to provide financial backing for the journey. Perhaps it was the sheer outlandishness of it. Perhaps it was her relative inexperience. In the end, it was the Director of Civil Aviation, Sir Sefton Branca, who finally took a chance on Amy, securing backers for her journey. But the final and most crucial ingredient of her journey, the plane, was still missing. The craft that would carry her all that way, a second-hand de Havilland gypsy moth, painted dark green and named Jason, was bought by her parents and she was ready to go. Monday the 5th of May. The starting point was London. There were 3 basic instruments which she would use to navigate to Australia: an altimeter, an airspeed indicator, and a compass. Most navigation was done by looking for landmarks or following a route on a map. Fuel had to be pumped in by hand. There was no radio and no way of signalling for help. Once you're up there, you were alone. So off she went on this great journey and arrived in Vienna late in the afternoon. Despite being a qualified ground engineer, the Austrian mechanics would not allow her to work on her own plane, and she found that the next morning she had to clean up their shoddy work. From there she stopped at Aleppo on Wednesday. On Thursday, she flew towards Baghdad.
But a sandstorm over the desert caused her engine to give out and she dropped 2,000 feet before it spluttered back to life again. This continued over and over until she was forced to land and wait 3 hours for the storm to clear.
She reached Baghdad on Friday.
But upon landing, one of the undercarriage struts broke. It was soon fixed.
But as she flew over the Persian Gulf and landed at Bandar Abbas in Iran, it broke again, and she spent the entire night fixing it, along with the rest of the plane, with the British consul's mechanic. On the Saturday, after flying 9 hours to Karachi, now in Pakistan.
Upon landing, she realised that one of the plugs had been incorrectly set the night before and was causing sparks. Had it been closer to the engine, it could have caused a fire. It was now the 6th day of her journey. She had flown 4,000 miles and beaten the speed record for a flight from England to India, previously held by Bert Hinkler. She was well on her way to beating his England to Australia record.
She set off again the next day and reached Jhansi in India. On the morning of Monday the 12th, she set off and reached Calcutta in the evening. The next morning she flew through a monsoon to Rangoon in Burma and crash-landed on playing fields 10 miles away. Jason ended up nose down in a ditch, with one of the wings smashed, a tyre ripped open and the undercarriage damaged.
Amy was in despair. One can only imagine the sadness and frustration caused by the realisation that her journey may be over, having come so far and achieved so much. But, as luck would have it, she crashed near the engineering institute, and soon dozens of students came to help.
Together they managed to fix the damaged plane, working continually in pouring rain and swarms of insects, until Thursday, when the repairs were finished and Jason was towed to Rangoon. She set off for Bangkok on Friday.
The time lost due to repairs meant that she could no longer beat Bert Hinkler's record, and it must have caused considerable sadness to realise that. However, like the Cutty Sark in her famous race against the Thermopylae, which she lost, all that mattered now was reaching the finishing line.
After getting lost in the mountains, a half-hour journey which turned into a 3-hour one, she reached Bangkok in the evening and was greeted by a huge crowd.
One wonders how she was coping with exhaustion. She was flying for an average of 9 hours a day, often through difficult and perilous conditions which required immense skill and concentration. She was off again on Saturday morning, but a heavy storm forced her to fly as low as 50 feet to follow the coastline. The rain was so strong that she couldn't see through her goggles, and she was forced to fly without them, the rain stinging her face and eyes.
Landing at Singora in Thailand, once again thousands flocked to see her. She landed at Singapore on Sunday and left the following morning for Java.
A violent rainstorm forced her to fly lower and lower until she was almost skimming the water. A lack of fuel forced her to land in the bamboo fields of a sugar factory, which caused a number of holes in Jason's wings. These were soon repaired, but the work cost another day. She would not set off for Timor Island until Thursday.
Darkness and a lack of fuel meant that she could not land where she wanted on the island and so had to make do.
She soon saw dozens of tribesmen armed with knives and spears racing towards her, and she was probably thinking, "Oh, hang on, I'm gonna get killed here." But fortunately, the leader took her through the jungle to a church mission, where she was soon met by officials from the aerodrome where she was supposed to land. On Saturday the 24th of May, Empire Day, there came the last leg of her journey. Flying over the ocean, she spotted a ship and people on deck and threw a cake down to them.
And then, seeing Melville Island, she knew she was close to her destination.
And dramatically threw her navigation notes out of the cockpit.
Approaching Darwin, she could see the crowds throng the airport. And she landed. One can only imagine the emotions of the moment. To have overcome so many challenges, endured so many setbacks, but carried on resolutely, even when she knew she could not beat the record but still make another. The next few days must have felt like a whirlwind. There were important people to meet, crowds to wave to, letters to answer, and the beginning of Amy Mania. The song Amy became a hit, soon followed by songs like Our Aeroplane Girl, and all manner of commemorative objects were made. She was awarded a CBE in the King's Birthday Honours, and on a flight to Sydney as a passenger she met her future husband Jim Mollison. Together they became an aviation power couple, the Flying Mollisons, who regularly flew together. An attempt to break the world long-distance record ended, however, in a crash in Connecticut, which injured them both.
Throughout the 1930s, she set a number of solo and co-pilot records, dined with Roosevelt and Amelia Earhart, was made the youngest president of the Women's Engineering Society, and given more awards than you could hang your hat on.
In 1940, she joined the women's section of the Air Transport Auxiliary, who transported aircraft between bases and from factories to airfields.
On the 5th of January 1941, on a flight from Blackpool to Oxford, she went missing in bad weather over the Thames estuary. There's some debate over the circumstances of her death, but I think it's more appropriate to reflect on her achievements, as the Yorkshire Evening Post wrote just a few days after her death.
By her remarkable flights to Australia, to America, to Japan and China and across Africa and the equinox to the Cape, she proved that women could achieve and maintain a high place in aviation.